So, last week we read the story Professor Andrews Goes to Warsaw, during which the psychology professor who lives in London goes to Warsaw to deliver lectures. The day after he touched down, he started experiencing several events that he felt quite unfamiliar with. We now know from the timeline that Professor Andrews was there when the martial law was imposed in 1981. The story mentions food shortages, tanks, loss of connection, etc., etc., and these were all the result of the martial laws. In this presentation, I will give you some background information on the 2 years of hardship the laws brought, how it came about, and what its impacts were. Now, although the laws were imposed in 1981, the economic hardships were quite prevalent a decade prior. In 1970, several strikes at the Lenin shipyard occurred. Many people were killed as a result, but nothing changed legislative-wise. In 1980, workers at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk went on strike once again in response to the rising food prices, general workers' rights, and working conditions. The 1980 strike was led by an electrician, Lech Wałęsa, and was supported by so many people that the authorities eventually gave in and signed the Gdansk Agreement. Now, the Gdansk Agreement was an authentic, binding social contract with the government. It mostly gave the rights back to workers. Things that were agreed on included legitimizing non-government controlled trade unions, guaranteeing the right to strike, freedom of speech, more accurate wage and price adjustments, all that, altogether 21 points. More importantly, though, the Gdansk Agreement led to the creation of Solidarity, the first non-communist party-controlled trade union. The leader was the electrician Lech Wałęsa. It is believed that the imposition of martial law was to prevent Solidarity spiraling out of the grasps of the authorities. The prime minister at that time was Jaruzelski. A few months after becoming prime minister, he also accepted the job as the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Polish United Workers' Party, which is just a glamorous way of saying the top man of the Communist Party in Poland. According to his previous correspondence records, he did plan on imposing martial law before becoming the leader of the Communist Party, but that didn't happen until December of 1981. Armed with fake recordings, he accused Solidarity for planning a military coup. And in order for him, he says, to protect Poland from a Soviet invasion, martial law was necessary. And this is what Professor Andrews experienced. First of all, borders and airspace were closed, so he obviously arrived in Poland before the law came into effect. Then the telephone lines were disconnected. Professor Andrews thus cannot contact Gosha. If he attempted to write, his letters would also be subjected to censorship. Professor Andrews did not see or meet any union leaders or anyone affiliated because these people were mostly detained. And he didn't write about protests, but many protests at that time happened, and it all ended in bloodshed. Years later, the calculated deaths during that time was approximately 90 people, but we would never know. The rights Gdansk Agreement had promised the workers were stripped away, and institutions like universities were inspected to find those associated with Solidarity. People were hyper-vigilant as military courts were established to bypass regular court systems for the purpose of prosecuting traitors, as the authorities saw it. The military crackdown was the reason why Professor Andrews saw the tank on the street. And I would say it probably looked like this. Now, eventually, in the summer of 1983, the laws were lifted. But that didn't mean that people instantly had a fulfilling and rich life. In a newspaper article written a year before, the correspondent speculated that freedom would still be restricted after the ban, and that was definitely the case in 1983. Workers were not given back the rights and privileges the Gdansk Agreement had promised them. Economic reforms, end quote, the government imposed not only did not raise living standards, but prices were inflated so much that the most basic products or foods were rationed. The hardship once again endured by the Polish people led to mass emigration to other countries in Europe. In order to show the world the situation in their country, activists continuously hijacked international flights, and at one point they even took over the Polish embassy in Switzerland. The international community obviously condemned the martial law, but there are a few conspiracy theories floating around with regards to other countries' involvement in the planning and execution of the law. None of these have been verified yet, and as far as my research goes, no one is planning on opening an investigation anytime soon. This is just a really, really short presentation on how, like, what happened during that time, 1981 to 83. I hope it was informative, and I hope you have, it gives you some clarity of what Professor Andrews was experiencing at that time. Thank you.